Jason had always dreamed of owning a home. Not just any home, but one where he could truly feel at peace. A place that felt like his own little corner of the world. After years of saving, working overtime, and cutting back on luxuries, he finally saved enough for a down payment. The day he signed the papers for his new house in a quiet suburban neighborhood was one of the happiest days of his life. It wasn't a mansion or anything extravagant, but it was perfect for him. A cozy two-bedroom house with a small backyard and plenty of natural light streaming through the windows. The neighborhood seemed ideal too. Rows of tidy houses lined the streets, each one painted in soft pastel colors with manicured lawns stretching out like green carpets. Kids rode their bikes along the sidewalks, and elderly couples strolled hand in hand in the evenings. There was even a community park nearby with swings, picnic tables, and a basketball court. Everything about the area screamed family-friendly and safe. Jason couldn't wait to settle in and start this new chapter of his life. But what Jason didn't know when he moved in was that living in this particular neighborhood came with its own set of challenges. Challenges that weren't listed in the real estate brochure or mentioned during the home inspection. This wasn't just any ordinary subdivision. It was part of a homeowners association, HOA, which meant there were rules, lots of them. Rules about what color you could paint, your front door, how tall your grass could grow before it became a punishable offense, and whether or not you were allowed to hang clothes outside to dry. Most people learn to live with these regulations, finding ways to adapt while still maintaining some semblance of individuality. But Jason quickly discovered that navigating life in an HOA wasn't going to be as simple as he'd hoped. What made things worse was that this HOA had a reputation, and at the center of it all was one person, Patricia. If you asked anyone in the neighborhood, they'd tell you stories about her. Some called her Karen, others referred to her as the enforcer, but no matter what nickname stuck, everyone agreed on one thing. Patricia ruled the HOA with an iron fist. She wasn't officially in charge, but she acted like she was, attending every meeting, filing complaints against neighbors, and patrolling the streets like a self-appointed guardian of order. Her sharp tongue and unrelenting attitude earned her both fear and disdain among residents. Jason first encountered Patricia shortly after moving in. He was standing in his driveway, unloading boxes from his car, when she appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Dressed in a pressed blouse and khaki pants, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand, Patricia introduced herself with a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, her tone clipped and formal. Before Jason could respond, she launched into a detailed explanation of the HOA's rules. No flags on porches, no visible trash cans, and absolutely no modifications to the exterior of the house without prior approval. By the time she finished, Jason felt more like he'd been scolded than welcomed. At first, Jason tried to brush off Patricia's behavior as harmless eccentricity. After all, maybe she was just passionate about keeping the neighborhood looking nice. Maybe her strictness stemmed from good intentions. But as the weeks went by, Jason began to see a different side of her, one that was far less charming. Neighbors whispered cautionary tales whenever he crossed paths with them. One man complained that Patricia reported him for having a garden gnome that was too whimsical. Another woman shared how Patricia demanded she remove her wind chimes because they were distracting. Even minor infractions like leaving holiday decorations up past December 31st warranted angry letters slipped under doors. Despite hearing these stories, Jason decided to give Patricia the benefit of the doubt. He figured he could avoid trouble by simply following the rules. Besides, he had bigger plans for his house. Plans that included creating a small oasis in his backyard, a tranquil space where he could unwind after long days at work. He envisioned a modest fountain surrounded by potted plants and fairy lights strung overhead. It would be subtle yet elegant, adding charm without being over the top. Surely something so tasteful wouldn't raise any eyebrows, right? Wrong. As fate would have it, Jason's decision to install the fountain marked the beginning of a feud that would escalate far beyond anything he ever imagined. Little did he know Patricia's obsession with control was about to collide head-on with his desire for independence. and neither of them was willing to back down. Jason's backyard fountain was supposed to be a peaceful addition to his home, a small touch of beauty that would make his space feel more inviting. He spent weeks planning it, sketching out designs, and visiting local garden stores to pick the perfect pieces. The fountain itself wasn't extravagant. It was a modest stone structure with a gentle trickle of water that created a soothing sound. To Jason, it felt like the perfect finishing touch for his new sanctuary. But little did he know, this seemingly harmless project would become the spark that ignited a firestorm in the neighborhood. It all started one sunny Saturday morning when Jason decided to install the fountain. He woke up early, eager to get the job done before the heat of the day set in. With tools in hand and music playing softly from his phone, he worked steadily through the morning. By noon, the fountain was securely in place, and Jason stood back to admire his handiwork. It looked beautiful, exactly as he'd envisioned. He turned on the water, listening to the soft gurgle as it flowed over the stones. For a moment, everything felt right in the world. But peace rarely lasts long in neighborhoods governed by strict HOA rules, and Jason's tranquil afternoon was about to be interrupted. Just as he was packing up his tools, he heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking against pavement. Looking up, he saw Patricia marching toward him, her clipboard once again in tow. Her lips were pursed, and her brow was furrowed, giving her an expression that could freeze water. Jason sighed inwardly but forced a polite smile. "Hi, Patricia," he said, trying to sound cheerful despite the sinking feeling in his stomach. "Jason," she replied curtly, not bothering to return the greeting. Instead, she stopped a few feet away, eyeing the fountain with obvious disapproval. "I see you've added something to your yard." Her tone made it clear she didn't approve. "It's a fountain," Jason explained, gesturing toward it. "I thought it would add a nice ambiance to the backyard." Patricia's eyes narrowed as she flipped through the pages on her clipboard. "Did you submit a request for approval to the HOA board? According to our guidelines, any modifications to the exterior of a property must be pre-approved." Jason blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't even considered needing permission for something so minor. "Honestly, no. I didn't think it was necessary. It's just a small fountain. It doesn't change the structure of the house or anything." "Well, that's not how it works," Patricia snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "The rules are very clear. You can't just go adding things without consulting the board first. What if everyone started doing whatever they wanted? This neighborhood would turn into a chaotic mess." Jason couldn't help but roll his eyes. Slightly. The idea of a single fountain causing chaos seemed absurd. Still, he tried to remain calm. "Look, I understand the importance of keeping things uniform, but this is hardly going to ruin the neighborhood aesthetic. If anything, it enhances it." Patricia wasn't having it. She tapped her pen against her clipboard, her jaw tightening. "That's not for you to decide. The HOA exists to maintain standards, and those standards apply to everyone equally. Unless you want a formal warning letter, I suggest you remove it immediately." Jason felt his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He had done nothing wrong, nothing that would harm anyone or detract from the neighborhood's appearance. Yet here was Patricia, acting as though he'd committed some grave offense. "I'll think about it," he said diplomatically, hoping to end the conversation before it escalated further. Unfortunately, Patricia wasn't satisfied with vague promises. Over the next few days, Jason received not one, but 3 official warning letters from the HOA, all delivered personally by Patricia herself. Each letter reiterated the same demand: remove the fountain or face consequences. The final notice even included a thinly veiled threat of fines and potential legal action if he failed to comply. What irritated Jason most wasn't just the frequency of the warnings, but the hypocrisy behind them. As he walked around the neighborhood, he noticed plenty of other homes with similar features: flower beds, bird baths, even small statues that hadn't been flagged by Patricia or the HOA. Why was his fountain being singled out while others got away with far more elaborate decorations? It didn't take long for him to realize this wasn't really about the fountain at all. This was personal. Determined to stand his ground, Jason decided to dig deeper. He visited the HOA office during their open hours, asking to review the community guidelines. To his surprise, the rules regarding landscaping were surprisingly vague. While they mentioned uniformity and aesthetic consistency, there was no specific clause banning fountains or similar features. In fact, several sections explicitly allowed residents to enhance their properties as long as the changes weren't detrimental to the neighborhood's overall look. Armed with this information, Jason wrote a polite but firm response to the HOA, explaining why he believed his fountain fell within acceptable parameters. He attached photos of other homes with decorative elements, highlighting the inconsistency in enforcement. Then, he waited. Days passed without a reply. At first, Jason hoped the matter had been dropped. Perhaps the HOA board would recognize the unfairness of targeting him while ignoring others. But instead of resolving the issue, Patricia doubled down. During the next HOA meeting, she openly criticized Jason, accusing him of being disrespectful and deliberately flouting the rules. Her accusations were dramatic and overblown, painting him as someone who cared nothing for the community's well-being. Word of the confrontation spread quickly among neighbors. Some sympathized with Jason, whispering that Patricia was taking things too far. Others sided with her, believing that following the rules, no matter how trivial, was essential for maintaining order. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, turning what should have been a minor disagreement into a full-blown neighborhood drama. For Jason, the situation was infuriating. He hadn't asked for any of this. All he wanted was to enjoy his home and make it feel like his own. But Patricia's relentless campaign against him left him feeling cornered and frustrated. Every time he saw her walking past his house, clipboard in hand, he couldn't shake the sense that she was watching him, waiting for another excuse to pounce. As the days turned into weeks, Jason found himself growing increasingly resentful. He knew removing the fountain wouldn't solve anything. It would only validate Patricia's bullying tactics. Yet standing his ground meant risking fines, strained relationships with neighbors, and endless headaches. It seemed like no matter what choice he made, he was bound to lose. Still, deep down, Jason refused to back down entirely. If Patricia wanted a fight, she was going to get one, but not in the way she expected. Unbeknownst to her, Jason was already plotting his next move. After all, if she was willing to play dirty, then maybe it was time to show her exactly what happened when someone pushed too hard. Jason's frustration with Patricia and the HOA had reached a boiling point. Every day felt like a battle, and the constant pressure was wearing him down. He tried to stay calm, reminding himself that this was just a phase, a temporary storm he could weather if he kept his cool. But one morning, as he shuffled into the kitchen to start his coffee maker, something unusual caught his attention. The water from the tap sputtered weakly before stopping altogether. At first, he thought it might be a fluke, a glitch in the plumbing, or perhaps an issue with the city's supply line. After all, random outages weren't unheard of. But when Jason checked other faucets throughout the house, the reality hit him hard. There was no water anywhere. No shower, no sink, no flushing toilets, nothing. Panic began to creep in as he realized how inconvenient this would be. Without water, even basic tasks became impossible. He couldn't brush his teeth, wash dishes, or make his morning cup of coffee. It was chaos, and it made absolutely no sense. Determined to figure out what was going on, Jason grabbed a flashlight and headed outside to inspect the main water line leading into his house. As he knelt down near the meter box, he noticed something alarming. The pipe had been deliberately cut. The jagged edges of the metal gleamed under the sunlight, clearly showing signs of tampering. Someone hadn't just damaged his water line, they had sabotaged it intentionally. Fury surged through Jason as the pieces clicked together. There was only one person who stood to gain from this kind of mischief: Patricia. Who else would stoop so low as to destroy someone's property over a disagreement about a backyard fountain? It wasn't just spiteful, it was malicious. And now, thanks to her actions, Jason was left without running water in his own home. Shaking with anger, Jason called the local utility company to report the damage. When they arrived later that afternoon, the technician confirmed his suspicions. "This wasn't an accident," the man said, shaking his head as he examined the severed pipe. "Looks like someone took bolt cutters to it. You'll need to file a police report if you want to press charges." "Press charges? Against Patricia?" Jason hesitated. While he had no doubt she was behind this, proving it would be another matter entirely. Unless he had concrete evidence tying her to the crime, accusing her outright might backfire. The last thing he needed was for her to deny everything and turn the tables on him, painting him as unstable or vindictive. Still, he couldn't let this go unanswered. Someone had crossed a line, and he intended to find out exactly who. The next step was reporting the incident to the HOA board. Jason figured that if nothing else, they should at least be aware of what was happening in their own community. Maybe they'd finally see Patricia for the troublemaker she truly was. So, armed with photos of the damaged pipe and a written account of the events, Jason attended the next HOA meeting. As expected, Patricia was there, sitting front and center, with her clipboard balanced neatly on her lap. She looked up briefly when Jason entered the room but quickly averted her gaze, pretending to focus intently on some papers in front of her. Jason ignored her icy demeanor and addressed the board directly, laying out the facts of the case as calmly as possible. "I woke up this morning to discover my water line had been cut," he explained. "Someone did this deliberately, and I believe it's connected to the ongoing dispute over my backyard fountain." The room fell silent as the board members exchanged uneasy glances. Clearly, none of them wanted to get involved in what was shaping up to be a messy situation. Finally, one of them cleared his throat and spoke. "That's unfortunate, Mr. Thompson. But do you have any proof that this was done by a specific individual?" Jason sighed inwardly. Of course they'd ask for proof. Without hard evidence, it was his word against whoever had committed the act. "Not yet," he admitted reluctantly. "But given the circumstances, I think it's reasonable to suspect foul play, especially since certain members of this community seem determined to escalate matters unnecessarily." Though he didn't name names, everyone knew exactly who he was referring to. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. Her silence spoke volumes, but it wasn't enough to convict her, not legally anyway. What Jason didn't realize at the time was that he wasn't the only one suspicious of Patricia's involvement. Later that evening, as he sat in his living room trying to come up with a plan of action, there was a soft knock at his door. Opening it, he found Mrs. Henderson, an elderly neighbor who lived 2 houses down. She glanced nervously over her shoulder before stepping inside. "I saw her," Mrs. Henderson whispered, clutching her sweater tightly around her shoulders. "Last night around midnight. I couldn't sleep, so I was reading by the window. That's when I noticed Patricia sneaking around your yard. She had something in her hand, a tool maybe, and she looked, well, guilty." Jason's heart raced. This was the break he'd been hoping for. If Mrs. Henderson was willing to testify, it could provide the evidence he needed to expose Patricia once and for all. But as much as he wanted justice, he also knew dragging an elderly woman into the fray might not be fair to her. Besides, Patricia was cunning. Even with a witness, she might find a way to wriggle out of responsibility. "Thank you for telling me this," Jason said gently, offering Mrs. Henderson a reassuring smile. "I appreciate your honesty, but please don't worry yourself too much. I'll handle it." Once she left, Jason paced the length of his living room, his mind racing. He had options, sure, but which path should he take? Reporting Patricia to the authorities based on hearsay alone would likely lead nowhere. Confronting her directly might give her the satisfaction of knowing she'd rattled him. No. He needed a different approach, an unconventional one that would force her to reveal her true colors while teaching her a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. And then it hit him, an idea so bold, so audacious that it bordered on genius. What better way to show Patricia the impact of her actions than by giving her a taste of her own medicine? Not just on him, but on the entire neighborhood. After all, if she was willing to disrupt his life over something as trivial as a backyard fountain, Why shouldn't she experience the same level of inconvenience multiplied tenfold? With renewed determination, Jason began researching the layout of the neighborhood's water system. It didn't take long to uncover a crucial detail. The entire subdivision shared a single master shutoff valve located near the entrance gates. This valve controlled the flow of water to every home in the development. If someone were to turn it off, even temporarily, the entire community would lose access to water. It was drastic, yes, but sometimes drastic measures were necessary to expose hypocrisy and restore balance. As Jason plotted his next move, he couldn't help but feel a mixed control of guilt and excitement. Guilt because he knew causing widespread disruption wasn't exactly ethical. Excitement because, deep down, part of him relished the thought of seeing Patricia squirm when she realized the consequences of her behavior extended far beyond her own vendetta. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about sending a message that bullying, sabotage, and unchecked power had consequences. And if the HOA board refused to address the problem, then Jason would make sure they couldn't ignore it any longer. Little did Patricia know, her days of ruling the neighborhood with fear were numbered. Jason's patience had run out, and now it was time for her to face the music in the most unexpected way possible. As Jason sat in his dimly lit living room, staring at the blueprint of the neighborhood's water system spread across his coffee table, a plan began to take shape. At first, the idea of cutting off water to the entire subdivision felt extreme, even reckless. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Patricia had gone out of her way to make his life miserable, all because of a minor disagreement over a backyard fountain. She'd crossed lines that shouldn't have been crossed, and now it was time for her to understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end of such pettiness. Jason knew this wasn't just about revenge. It was about exposing the absurdity of Patricia's behavior and holding her accountable for her actions. If she could sabotage his water line without hesitation, then surely she deserved a taste of her own medicine, but on a much larger scale. By targeting the master shutoff valve, Jason wouldn't just inconvenience Patricia, he'd disrupt the entire neighborhood. And in doing so, he hoped to force the HOA board, and everyone else, to confront the reality of how toxic their community dynamics had become. The first step was gathering information. Jason spent hours researching how the master valve worked, reading online forums and watching videos about municipal water systems. He learned that turning off the valve was relatively simple. All it required was a wrench and some basic knowledge of how to operate it. The tricky part would be timing. He needed to act when no one was around, late at night or early in the morning, to avoid being seen. Stealth was key. If anyone caught him tampering with the valve, the consequences could be severe. Once he felt confident in his understanding of the process, Jason prepared for the operation. He borrowed a sturdy wrench from his toolbox and slipped it into a small duffel bag, along with a flashlight and gloves. To further minimize suspicion, he dressed in dark clothing and wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He even parked his car several blocks away, walking the rest of the distance to ensure no one noticed anything unusual. The night he chose for his mission was perfect. Clear skies, minimal traffic, and most importantly, quiet streets. As midnight approached, Jason stepped outside and began making his way toward the entrance of the subdivision where the master valve was located. His heart pounded in his chest, each step echoing loudly in the stillness of the night. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was he really going through with this? What if someone saw him? What if things spiraled out of control? But as he neared the valve enclosure, a small metal box partially hidden by bushes, he pushed those thoughts aside. This wasn't about fear or hesitation anymore. It was about justice. Taking a deep breath, Jason knelt down and opened the box. Inside, the valve gleamed faintly under the moonlight, its handle waiting to be turned. With steady hands, he positioned the wrench and gave it a firm twist. There was a soft click, followed by an almost imperceptible hum as the flow of water stopped. For a brief moment, Jason hesitated. Had it worked? Was the entire neighborhood truly without water now? He stood up, scanning the area for any signs of movement or sound. Everything remained eerily silent. Satisfied that his plan had succeeded, he quickly packed up his tools and retraced his steps back home, careful not to leave behind any evidence of his presence. Back in the safety of his house, Jason allowed himself a small smile. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. Now came the hard part, waiting to see how the neighborhood reacted. He imagined the chaos that would unfold as residents woke up to find their faucets dry, their showers useless, and their dishwashers refusing to run. How long would it take them to realize something was wrong? Would they panic? Blame each other? Or would they band together to figure out what had happened? As dawn broke the next morning, Jason peeked through his curtains to gauge the situation. Sure enough, people were already milling about outside, their expressions ranging from confusion to frustration. Some carried buckets while others inspected their water meters in vain attempts to diagnose the problem. Phones buzzed incessantly as texts and calls flew between neighbors, spreading news of the outage. It didn't take long for rumors to start circulating. Who had done this? Why? And most importantly, when would the water come back on? Predictably, Patricia was among the loudest voices complaining about the situation. Dressed in her usual pressed attire, she stormed from house to house, clipboard in hand, demanding answers. "This is unacceptable," she shouted at anyone within earshot. "We pay good money to live here, and this kind of incompetence is outrageous." Jason couldn't help but chuckle as he watched her rant from his window. Here she was, outraged, over something she couldn't control, something she herself had indirectly caused. The irony wasn't lost on him. In her quest to punish him for a minor infraction, Patricia had inadvertently set the stage for her own downfall. Now, instead of playing the victim, she was front and center in a crisis she couldn't explain away. By mid-morning, the HOA board had called an emergency meeting to address the growing unrest. Dozens of angry residents gathered in the community center, their tempers flaring as they demanded solutions. The atmosphere was tense, with accusations flying left and right. Some blamed the city for failing to maintain the infrastructure. Others suspected vandalism, pointing fingers at teenagers or outsiders looking to cause trouble. Through it all, Patricia remained vocal, insisting that someone must be held accountable for the disruption. Sitting quietly in the back of the room, Jason observed the scene with a mix of satisfaction and amusement. The very people who had ignored his complaints about Patricia were now experiencing firsthand the kind of havoc she thrived on creating. Their frustration mirrored his own during the weeks he'd spent dealing with her harassment. Only now, there was no easy fix. No quick letter or warning could resolve the issue. They were stuck until the source of the problem was identified. As the meeting dragged on, Jason noticed cracks forming in the neighborhood's facade. Longtime friends argued over trivial details, and alliances shifted as blame bounced from one person to another. Even the HOA board members looked frazzled, struggling to keep order amidst the chaos. It was exactly the outcome Jason had hoped, for not because he enjoyed seeing his neighbors suffer, but because it exposed the fragility of their community. Without cooperation and mutual respect, even the smallest issues could spiral into full-blown disasters. Still, Jason knew he couldn't sit idly by forever. Eventually, someone would trace the outage back to the master valve, and questions would arise. When that happened, he needed to be ready. For now, though, he let the drama play out, content to watch as Patricia and the HOA board scrambled to regain control of a situation they never should have ignored in the first place. In the days that followed, Jason kept a close eye on developments. Water trucks were brought in to provide temporary relief, and repair crews arrived to inspect the system. Meanwhile, tensions continued to simmer, with Patricia growing increasingly desperate to deflect attention from herself. Little did she know her biggest challenge was yet to come. Because while cutting off the water had been a bold move, Jason wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The days following the water outage were nothing short of chaotic in the neighborhood. Without running water, daily routines ground to a halt. Showers turned into sponge baths, dishes piled up in sinks, and lawns began to yellow under the relentless sun. Tempers flared as residents struggled to adapt to their new reality. Some resorted to buying bottled water by the case, while others lined up at local parks or schools where emergency water stations had been set up. The sense of inconvenience was palpable, but what truly made matters worse was the uncertainty. No one knew how long this would last, or why it had happened in the first place. Patricia, predictably, became the loudest voice in the crowd. She marched around the subdivision like a general rallying troops for battle, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand and her phone glued to her ear as she called everyone from the HOA board to city officials. Her frustration was evident, but so was her hypocrisy. Here she was, demanding answers and accountability, while conveniently ignoring the fact that her own actions had likely sparked the chain of events leading to this mess. Jason watched from afar, amused by the irony. It seemed fitting that the woman who thrived on control now found herself completely powerless. As the hours dragged on, the lack of water began to expose cracks not just in the infrastructure, but also in the relationships between neighbors. People who had once greeted each other warmly over backyard fences now exchanged sharp words and accusatory glances. One man accused his next-door neighbor of secretly using a garden hose to water his lawn, despite the drought-like conditions. Another family complained bitterly when they discovered someone had siphoned water from their outdoor spigot overnight. Even small children felt the tension, their laughter replaced by confusion as they saw adults snapping at each other over trivial matters. Amidst all this turmoil, Jason remained eerily calm. He went about his day as though nothing unusual was happening, even though he was acutely aware of the role he'd played in creating the situation. When neighbors approached him to vent their frustrations, he listened sympathetically, nodding along as if he shared their concerns. "It's terrible," he said more than once, shaking his head for emphasis. "I hope they figure it out soon." His acting skills were impressive enough to fool most people, though a few cast suspicious glances his way, wondering why he seemed so unfazed by the crisis. By the second day, the HOA board convened another emergency meeting, this time inviting representatives from the city's Public Works Department to attend. Dozens of residents packed into the community center, their faces red with anger and exhaustion. Babies cried in the background, and the air smelled faintly of sweat and desperation. The room buzzed with whispered theories about what might have caused the outage, everything from aging pipes to deliberate sabotage. Patricia naturally seized the opportunity to take center stage. "This is unacceptable," she declared, slamming her fist on the podium for dramatic effect. "We pay our dues to ensure these kinds of things don't happen, yet here we are, suffering because of someone's incompetence, or worse, negligence." Her words ignited a chorus of agreement from the crowd, but Jason noticed something telling. No one stepped forward to defend her. Instead, many exchanged skeptical looks as if silently questioning whether Patricia might somehow be involved. After all, wasn't she always stirring up trouble? Hadn't she recently clashed with Jason over his backyard fountain? These thoughts lingered unspoken but were impossible to ignore. When the floor opened for questions, chaos erupted. Residents shouted over one another, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of complaints. One man demanded to know why the HOA hadn't inspected the water system sooner. A woman tearfully described how the outage had ruined her plans for hosting a birthday party for her daughter. Someone else suggested organizing a protest outside City Hall. Through it all, the HOA board members sat frozen, unsure of how to regain control of the situation. Finally, a representative from the Public Works Department stood up to address the crowd. "We've identified the source of the problem," he announced, holding up a hand to quiet the murmurs. "The master shutoff valve at the entrance of the subdivision has been manually turned off. We're currently investigating whether this was an accident or intentional tampering." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Intentional tampering? That meant someone had deliberately caused the outage. The idea sent a ripple of unease through the audience. Who among them could be capable of such an act? Suspicion immediately turned toward outsiders, perhaps teenagers looking for mischief or disgruntled former residents seeking revenge. But Jason noticed something else. Several pairs of eyes darted toward Patricia. Whether consciously or not, people couldn't help but associate her with conflict. Seizing the moment, Jason raised his hand and asked the question everyone was thinking. but too afraid to voice. Has anyone considered that this might be connected to recent disputes within the neighborhood? He paused, letting the implication hang in the air before continuing. For example, there's been a lot of tension lately over certain disagreements. Maybe this is someone's way of making a statement. His comment drew mixed reactions. Some nodded thoughtfully, while others frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the suggestion. Patricia, however, bristled visibly. "Are you implying I had something to do with this?" she snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at him. "Because let me tell you, I've done nothing but uphold the rules and protect the integrity of this community." Jason held up his hands in mock surrender. "I'm not accusing anyone specifically," he replied smoothly. "Just saying it's worth considering all possibilities." The exchange only added fuel to the fire. By the end of the meeting, tensions were higher than ever, with accusations flying freely and no real solutions in sight. As people filed out of the community center, Jason lingered near the back, observing the fractured dynamics of the group. What had once been a relatively peaceful neighborhood was now a powder keg waiting to explode, and he knew exactly how to light the fuse. That evening, Jason decided to escalate his plan further. While the neighborhood stewed in its collective frustration, he anonymously slipped flyers under every door in the subdivision. The flyers were simple yet effective, featuring bold letters that read, "Is your water out because of Patricia?" Beneath the headline was a list of grievances against her: the constant nitpicking, the unfair enforcement of HOA rules, and, most damning of all, her recent altercation with Jason over the backyard fountain. At the bottom, a single sentence urged readers to ask yourselves if living under her tyranny is worth the cost. Jason knew dropping these flyers was risky. It left a trail, however slight, that could potentially lead back to him. But he also knew it was necessary. If he wanted to expose Patricia's behavior, he needed to turn the neighborhood against her, and judging by the whispers he overheard the next morning, his strategy was working. Clusters of residents gathered, in driveways and front yards, discussing the flyers with shocked expressions. Some dismissed them as gossip, but others began connecting the dots. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who had witnessed Patricia sneaking around Jason's yard, quietly confirmed parts of the story to a few trusted friends. Word spread quickly, and soon Patricia found herself facing a wave of suspicion she couldn't deflect. For Jason, watching the fallout unfold was both satisfying and surreal. He hadn't intended to become the neighborhood's de facto whistleblower, but the role suited him well. With each passing hour, Patricia's grip on the community weakened, replaced by growing resentment and distrust. The HOA board, meanwhile, scrambled to address the mounting pressure from residents who demanded answers, not just about the water outage, but also about Patricia's conduct. And still, Jason wasn't done. He knew the final confrontation was inevitable, and when it came, he planned to make sure Patricia faced the full consequences of her actions. For now, though, he leaned back in his chair, sipping a glass of water he'd stored in advance, and smiled. The game was far from over, but the pieces were falling into place exactly as he'd hoped.